In this video, we're going to continue with our project by continuing to set up our scene. There are a few things we need to complete before we move on to some other topics. Primarily, we need to add some boxes and some buckets that we will be able to drop our game ball inside of, and also some walls to kind of create a room. So this video is going to be a little bit more of some basics of creating entities and manipulating transform values and things like that. But I hope you follow along so we can continue with the larger project of creating a training simulator. So let's get started. In our last video, we added some collider components to both the game ball and the table, as well as a rigid body to the game ball, and then also a collider to the ground. So that enables this action to happen, which is when we press play, the ball falls to the table, it rolls off because it is reacting to a gravitational pull, and then it falls down to the ground, and it will continue to roll. But see, we want to add some walls in here that will stop the ball and will contain the ball so it won't be able to roll anywhere at once. And we also want to create some buckets. These buckets are an important part of this project in that they are the buckets that we are going to drop when you're in VR. You're going to drop the ball into so you can continue this training simulator activity. So let's get started first with the buckets, and we'll go from there. I'm going to stop my scene, and we are going to start by creating a blue bucket. Now, there are a few ways we want to set this up. There's a few empty entities we want to create. So we will do that, and it'll make more sense as we continue on through the course. But we're going to create an empty entity, and we're just going to call it buckets. We're going to create another empty entity, and we're going to call it, rename it, blue bucket. We're going to create one last entity, empty entity, and call it orange bucket. And unsurprisingly, we're going to create an orange bucket and a blue bucket. Let's grab each of the blue bucket entity and as well as the orange bucket entity and drag that into the buckets parent entity. So if we drop that down, we then have two other sub-entities called blue bucket and orange bucket. And then we're going to add the boxes and the entities, the box entity, primitive entities to create these and nest them inside the respective blue bucket and orange bucket. The reason why we want to have these all nested inside one bucket is because we're going to create a behavior later on in this course that will move both of them together. So that's an important part of this. All right, so let's create an entity, and we're just going to choose a box entity. And let's actually, before we do this, let's move the table offset this direction. That's probably good. All right, and for the first box entity, we're going to change some transform values. The Y translation value is going to be 0.075. So we're just going to move it up a little bit so it's above ground. And then we're going to select the uniform scale button. And we're going to change some of the sizing of this. So actually we want to keep the X the same, and then we're going to do 0.1 on the Y, and then we're going to leave the Z. So this is a very flat bucket. All right. We're going to create this box. Let's see, where's our box? Let's drag that onto our blue bucket over here. Now we can operate within the blue bucket empty entity or parent entity. All right, let's see. We want to change also the color of the blue bucket. This can be really whatever you want. I'm going to use official team colors of my favorite team, the Denver Broncos. You can choose whatever color you want, but orange and blue is good. So what I did was I have the box selected, I have material component opened, and then I go down to color diffuse, and I select the color picker here, and I'm just going to enter in the hex value. That didn't actually work, so I'll just type it in, 001489. Great. There it is. Now, before we move on, we do want to add a collider component to this entity. It's very important. You actually, well, it's not super important. It just is really helpful with making this a faster process. If you make everything you want, because we're going to be duplicating this entity, so we want to add everything and get this working the way we want, so that when we duplicate it, they'll all continue this. The duplicates will all have the copied components and colors and changes and all that. So then you don't have to add components and change the color afterwards. So we're going to go ahead and add a collider. And we don't need to change anything about the collider. It's fine as is. All right, so now I'm going to go over here into my entities panel and select box and then duplicate this. It is actually sitting inside of the same, inside of the box. So what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this, open up my transform component up here. And I'm going to rotate this by 90 degrees. I'm going to pretty much eye this. Let's do negative 90 degrees. There we go. And so I'm really just going to make sure that these all align up to make a square bucket as best as possible. Okay, that'll work. I'll duplicate box number 2. I'll rotate. Actually, let's just move this one to the other edge. Okay. We will duplicate that again. Now we're going to rotate it around the Y. Oops, what happened there? Rotate it around the Y axis. So now I got the Y axis to 90 degrees. And I'm going to move this over to this edge here. And then slide over so you can see my bucket starting to take shape. And we'll duplicate one last time and bring that over there. Okay, great. There's actually one more thing we need. So we have all the sides we want. We don't need a top because we want it to be buckets, so we won't be able to drop the ball inside. However, what we do need is we need a trigger box to exist at the very bottom. Now, this trigger box is actually going to be an invisible box that will trigger an action or a behavior to happen when the ball enters into that invisible trigger box. So what we need to do is let's just select box 1 or just box. And I'm going to duplicate that again. So one more time. So box 6 we want to change to trigger box. Now the geometry, we actually don't want it to have any geometry because all we really want is the collider on it. That's really, there's a number of ways we could have done this, but we're just duplicating the box, removing the geometry. So I'm going to go to geometry. Don't need to actually expand it. I'm just going to go to the properties gear icon and select that and then just hit remove. I'm going to slide that up a bit. And I'm going to change the properties, the transform properties to 0.7. 0.7. Now if I peer down in there, now you can see that box, the collider, really, down there in the bottom. It's invisible, so if I click out of it, you won't see it, but it is there. Now, an important part of this is that with the trigger box selected, select the collider component, and we do need to check this checkbox for trigger. So this will enable it to interact with the state machine. And again, when we get into behaviors and state machines, which is in a later tutorial, in a later video, this will make sense, and it will also be very important. So just make sure you do this and just hang tight because we will return to this in a later video. All right, I'm done with my blue bucket, so I'm gonna move this. I'm just gonna move it out of the way for the time being. All right, now I'm gonna do the same thing, but I need to create an orange bucket. So I'm gonna move a little bit faster here. So 0.075. And we want this to be 0.1. All right, and I'm gonna take my specific Broncos color. orange. Perfect. And then add a collider to it. Great. Now let's take this box and drop it onto the orange bucket. So I'm operating within this parent entity. Going to duplicate that and rotate it up to 90 degrees. Negative 90 degrees. I always make that mistake. We'll make another one, duplicate that, and then slide it over this way. Duplicate it again. This time we'll go around the X on the Y-axis, excuse me. And duplicate that one more time. And there it is. Okay. Great. And then lastly, remember I need to add a trigger box. I'm going to duplicate our first box to make box 6. I'm just going to call this trigger box 2. I'm going to remove the geometry component. And for the collider component, I'm going to make sure it's a trigger box. Or a trigger collider. Lastly, just going to make the size a little bit smaller and then bring it up. This part doesn't have to be exact because remember, it just needs to sit in the bottom of the box. All right. Now the orange bucket, I'm going to make... So I've completed our buckets. Now we want to position them right. Remember, I just moved my blue bucket out of the way, so we're going to fix that. But my orange bucket, I want to be -1. And actually, no, we just want to be +1. And then my blue bucket, we want to be -1. All right. There we go. So then now I have my buckets in place. And that's really the last thing I need to do with my buckets. I can collapse my buckets parent entity. And notice that now we have this large entity so I can move them together. I don't actually want to do that, so I'll just return this to 0. And next, we will work on the walls. And we are going to use quads to create these walls. And I'll explain why in just a moment. But first, let's create an empty entity, because this is going to house or nest all of the wall components, wall entities. So I'm just going to add an empty entity and just call it walls. All right, great. I'm going to create an entity, and I'm going to choose a quad. I'm going to drag that quad into walls. And I want to rename it. We're going to start with the left wall. Rename it left. Okay, so the values that we want are 2 for the translation, 1.5 Y translation, -3 for the Z translation value. Rotation is fine as is. For the scale, we want 10, 7, and 1 doesn't make a difference with a quad. And the reason why we want to make a quad is that notice that as I'm on this side of the wall, I can see it. As I move to this side of the wall, I cannot see it. So that way, we will always be able to see into our room, but when we're inside the room, we will not be able to see outside the room. That's the way quads work, and there's a very good reason why we want that and why that exists. It's because there are many instances and occasions where you want to see into something but not be able to see outside of it, or vice versa. All right, so we have our left wall. We do need to add a collider component. And you'll notice that it is a box collider around this wall, but the box collider extends a little bit too far beyond it. So we're going to change that to, let's do 0.5. 0.2 for the half extent value, the z half extent value. Okay, great. Now, we want to duplicate the left wall, and we're going to rename it right. We'll open up the transform. The only thing we really want to do is just to remove the minus from the z, because we want it to be just on the opposite side. However, we want to rotate it around the y-axis by 180 degrees, because remember, I can't see into my room, but I can see out, which is not what I want, so I need to rotate it by 180 degrees. Perfect. All right, now let's duplicate the right wall, and we will call this front, and because it has some different dimensions and some different translation values, transform values, we'll change it to 7, 1.5, and 0, and then negative 90 degrees that way. And where am I? 10, 7, 1. 6, 7, 1. I actually need to move this over to 0 on the z-axis. Okay, great. So I have all my walls except for the rear wall, or the back. So I'll just go front, duplicate the front wall, and then rename it to back. That is not quite right. I want it to be 0 on the X, or on the Z. And on the back, I want this to be okay. So now our back wall has a -3 on the X translation value, and then we need to flip this again around the Y value axis by 180 degrees, and I can do that by just removing the negative sign from the -90. Flip it around. There it is. So then as I move around, I can see the walls from the outside, but when I move my camera in, I cannot see outside my room. It's perfect. All right, one last thing I want to do is, this table is blending into the walls a little bit too closely. So I'm going to select my table and just change the material color. Right now it's straight white. I'm going to change it to a little bit darker gray. We don't want it quite as dark as the ground, but we do want it to stand out a little bit from the walls. Now let's see what happens when we press play on our scene. What should happen is the ball falls to the table, rolls off the table, falls to the ground, continues to roll, and it will bump into the wall. There it is. All right, so currently our scene is ready for the next step, which is setting up the state machine and using the state machine to create behaviors. Behaviors are a very, very important part of Amazon Sumerian. So we hope you continue on with this course to check out how to use the state machine. And a lot of this course is going to be around using the state machine because, again, it's the component that allows you to add interactivity and to make your scene a dynamic and changing scene. Very fun, very cool stuff. So we will see you in the next video.